the whole point is, if you're a good ops team, you are successful because your presence isn't felt, if that makes sense. Like, if everything's working well and there's no bugs and everything is seamless, the ops team is doing a really good job. How did I get into RevOps? Actually, like, I think everyone basically falls into RevOps somewhat by accident. They start doing another job, and then most people I've spoken to have started doing another job, and then they've kind of had an eye for the way things are working and sort of seen improvements.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the way it worked for me, almost. So I started off at a test as an intern when we were 20 people. For context, we're about 150 now.
Oh wow, okay.
So we've really grown over the last like 2 and a bit years. And I joined as a sales intern, and the role was literally sold as, you will be just giving data to the sales team. I was essentially doing the job of a platform that's like Cognizant, but for the sales team.
Oh
So
right, okay.
just sourcing data for them. And it was like weirdly dull, but also quite sort of like you could just sort of settle into it and do a day, and then, like, you know, it became quite addictive. But like, it was really interesting working with a growing, it was at 3 SDRs and 2 AEs at the time.
Wow.
And they were operating off HubSpot, and they just had the way that things were working just seemed so backwards to me. So I was like literally crawling the internet for these leads, and then uploading them to one system, and then uploading 30 at a time, and then uploading them to 2 systems, and then feeding them, and then sending them a list on Slack. And it was just a mess, basically. And I got essentially into architecting the way things work. So it was instead of like, okay, why do we, instead of sending over like, you know, 30 leads and uploading them to 2 systems, why don't we try and establish a link between HubSpot and SalesLoft at the time? Or why don't we have like a centralized thing, so Slack pings us once a day to say these are your leads, and then you just see them. And processes like that, basically. So it was essentially the thing that really got me interested from this role, from being just like kind of a data nerd and trying to work out like, the best results for a sales team, is actually the best results come from really getting them to focus on what they need to do. And if you can give them a way of doing what they like, less fiddling, or show them an easy way of doing things, then not only does it help them get to where they need to be, so they, you know, they need to hit 10 SQLs or whatever it may be, it helps them do more in their day because they're not fiddling around with stuff. But then it also gives you the ability to, if you've given them something which saves them time, it gives you the ability to you know, find out something else from them. And I'll talk about that a bit more. But like, you it's essentially like a trade. The whole relationship is like a trade. So you're giving them a way of doing things quicker, and then and then you can find out some more information about what they're doing perhaps in return, and then it's a sort of feedback loop. But yeah, that was how I kind of got into it. So started off by just sort of optimizing very small processes between systems, and then we decided to introduce Salesforce in 2019. So I kind of managed that project with basically no experience at all of how Salesforce works. Got there in the end. So like, it wasn't like, it was a bumpy road for sure, but we got there in about May. And then it's just been kind of building on new processes, new technologies, tearing down processes that have like been there before and aren't fit for purpose. And I just really enjoy essentially coming up with better ways of doing things that sort of streamline the business, make sure everyone's reading from the same hymn sheet, doing things quicker, and getting better, getting more money, basically. That's kind of it. That was a bit of work.
So it's been quite a learning on the job process, obviously. I get the impression that a lot of people have the similar thing where it's like, you don't as you say, read syllabus and then go into it knowing what to do, especially with like growing companies. It's like we've sort of found our way and we've somehow managed to create something pretty useful now.
I think it's definitely a degree of that, yeah, because it's like firstly, I think the way that certain businesses work, if there was a syllabus, I think a lot of people would go into it, and if there was a syllabus for this is how you do things, a lot of teams would go into it, implement a certain model, and it wouldn't work. Which is, I think, why like the fact that you guys are trying to do a blog where people share their experiences is far more useful than just having a here's how it works. Like it has to be the model that you set up has to be reactive to the way that your team run, basically. So if they're selling, if the software or product or service that's being sold is like a volume based sale, if it's you need to sell, it's £2,000 and then we need to sell absolutely loads of these, and then get them onto a slightly bigger package, versus a test, which is kind of going that way now, but at the time, a few years ago, we were selling multi £100,000 sales to people. They're much bigger, longer consultative sales processes, and in your RevOps function really has to be reactive to that sales process. So it has to be, if it was just a syllabus of this is how you set things up, you could only get so far. I think what's interesting, people sharing their experiences. For some people, like, an account-based sales approach might be really good, or having, targeting enterprise accounts. For other people, they need to make sure that their conversion rates are really what matters, so that they can their sales velocity is down, their conversion rates are as high as they can be, the time to sale is as low as they can be, and they can sell as much quantity as possible. So essentially, I think it's important to have a much more open sort of look at these things.
Yeah, and one that I was actually talking when someone said that she's based in one region but she gets pulled into another thing, and she had to learn how to adapt to different demands in different regions as well. And she also said that just no level of experience can guarantee expertise, because sometimes things will work in another company and then you go into like SaaS and it's just a whole new ball game. So it seems adaptability is the answer here.
100%. Yeah, I think one of my, I think I've only done RevOps at a test, so it's my first gig, as it were. But I think one of the really interesting challenges when that time comes will be to go into another company at some stage, and they've developed their RevOps structure either a lot or not at all, and then go, crap, I've got to try and understand something else that's like half formed, basically.
Definitely.
But yeah.
So Lissy said you guys had built 6 key dashboards, I think, from all this information, and that's working quite well. So how did you go about building those, and also how did you decide what goes into that?
Good question. So dashboards we built, we, as a RevOps team, up to a certain point, we decided that we were kind of sort of dancing around lots of different projects and going, what's the most, we could optimize the demand gen funnel, or we could move all of our data to account-based selling, or we could integrate Jiminy, or whatever it may be. We could do lots of different things. And the way that there were 2 things that we realized. Firstly, we don't have an end goal as a team.
Right.
Second one was that we don't know, because we aren't really talking to people. We are kind of servicing the sales team, but we're not actually talking to the sales team, and in particular the sales stakeholders, and really listening to what they want. And so kind of developing things that are, we think are very useful, and actually are very useful, but they might not be the most important thing at the time. And that was actually also, as time had, Lissy had been here for a year, and I've been here for, a little while. The sales team that I'd sort of started with was still there, but the whole company is different. Like the startups did, basically it's a new company every time it doubles. So everything was different. So we made those 2 changes, and the first change was, we're going to have ambassadors, we're going to have stakeholders who really feed into this process. So for the dashboard projects, we isolated, a set of stakeholders, so team leads and also users of the dashboards, to learn what they wanted, what they weren't currently getting, and test and essentially, work with them to listen to their requirements, run an actual proper review process. So like, we've built something, let's see, do you like it? What should change? And that was really important. But the second thing we did, which was arguably more important, was that we set one objective, which we've still really got, which is to make Salesforce the single source of truth.
Right.
Attest is a data we are a data and intelligence platform, slightly different to what you guys do, but like it is like our whole thing is giving confidence to people. Like, we want people to look at a dashboard or a set of data on consumers and go, I should make this decision. And we weren't necessarily doing that internally. There wasn't agreement over the metrics. We'd go into a meeting and go, the sales team would present an SQL number and it would be different to the next slide. The marketing team would present an SQL number, and that would be different. And it was like, and it just reduced confidence in the whole thing. We've just spent all of this time and effort. We could spend all of this time and effort building things on top of Salesforce that give us new functionality, but ultimately people are going into meetings and quoting different SQL numbers. And so we made making Salesforce a single source of truth the number one goal. Basically, we wanted all of the numbers that people quoted to come from a number in Salesforce, and we wanted instructions to be able to go, or it to be so intuitive that you go, oh, how do I find SQLs? Okay, I go to book dashboard, and there it is. So those were the two big changes we made: a single objective, single source of truth, and then also listening to stakeholders. And then from there, we came up with 5 dashboards. So looking at basically the start of the funnel, so marketing, demand generation, to the end of the funnel, revenue. And rather than having sort of like loads of different reports and loads of different dashboards and, producing one not for the time, we used to produce ones for like the now rather than like forever. And now we've got 6 that are basically forever. And yeah, that was the dashboard project. Basically, people are still using them.
Great.
There's always going to be a bit of slippage, like new people join, they're not necessarily up to speed with the changes that you've made. So there's always going to be a bit of slippage, but for the most part, for that kind of like 80% effectiveness, they're definitely there. Okay,
so when you had them like built and you were like, okay, finished product, done, was that like a date when you're like, okay, from now on we're going to start using those and you've all just got to start being able to read these, or was it quite a gradual process that everyone kind of got into as you were building them?
Yeah, so I think taking people on the journey with you is really important. So for our stakeholders, it was important. We involved them really heavily. So we wanted to make sure that they we ideated with them, then we built something, then we took it back to them. We wanted them to have issues with it. Like, we want them to be able to pick issues. Yeah. Maybe no issues, but like if someone's can say like, I think this should be like this, when they put it in the final product, it gives them a sense of ownership over it. And then secondly, as well, testing it with users, it means that we have an ambassador model, a test that extends across everything we do, actually. So all the kind of like actual product teams use ambassadors to test, like, they're ambassadors within the business who can feed back on something, and then they can also take it back to their teams and say, this is how you use this, or this is why we built this way, because this, and it's kind of just like inspires bottom-up confidence in the ideas that you're creating. So that was the first point. I think the second point was that you got to take the people that you have, that you're building it with, on the journey with you. In terms of the deployment, we made sure that the 6 dashboards as they were the only ones that were really accessible, and if there were more, we moved them out of sight, basically. So I think it's important, like, as well as if you're kind of like saying like, yeah, these are the 6 dashboards, and then you log in and there's 20 dashboards, it's just no good for anyone. Like the user interface needs to match what what you're actually telling people. So those were the two things. I think the last one was we just absolutely hammered the message. Like, I think as a RevOps team, you have a lot of, you're in a weird position because you're a relatively junior team within the business. I mean, me and Lissy are quite inexperienced. I graduated 3 years ago. Lissy graduated 1.5 years ago now, I think. Don't know, but so you're relatively junior, or at least young within the business. Like a lot of people, and you're working with sometimes sales leaders who have 10 years. So you're kind of and you have control over the metrics, what people see, how people do things. So you're kind of thrust into a big leadership role without necessarily having leadership experience, because you are essentially responsible for a lot of the ways people do things. And I think that's a challenge sometimes, but the way to overcome it is basically to over communicate what you're doing and why you're doing it. Like a big with RevOps, like it's only two of us, so we were kind of doing things and then also trying to talk people through it, so it's a lot of work. But a big part of it just became really over communicating the strategy, remembering that people, if you say something, likely people aren't listening, so you have to say it again several times. And there was big strong message repetition over Salesforce is the single source of truth. If it doesn't exist in Salesforce, it doesn't exist. And we just drilled that as much as possible. And then it was really the kind of fruits of our labor paid off when like a meeting, we had an all hands the other week to talk about like the revenue numbers. And our CEO Jeremy was running them from the board slides. I thought, oh, great. And then he said, but we're going to pull up Salesforce now and look at the live number. Pulled up the revenue dashboard and says, here it is. Remember, Salesforce is a single source of truth. And that's a really rewarding moment, because that kind of message discipline and repeating it and just making sure that everyone sort of knows what you're doing and why you're doing it was really impactful for getting people to actually align around those 6 dashboards and just make sure that everyone was using them, or at least like believe what they said. So now when people go into meetings, they can see with confidence. They can either bring up a Salesforce dashboard, or if the number in their Excel sheet is wrong, then the Salesforce is right. I should say as well, Salesforce is, in my opinion, like where the accurate figure data should be. But I don't object to people like, Salesforce reporting is good to a point. It's not going to do everything you want it to do. It's very easy and nice. Excel is like a great tool for just getting stuff into a way that either you can illustrate it for people to understand, so like do a quick calculation, or see a trend. Like, no objection to people using that. It's like, and I encourage it. I use it myself for like, basically, if someone asks me a question that would take ages to run in Salesforce, basically, so I'll do it in Excel. But like, as long as people know that Salesforce is where you get your data from, and these are the kind of rules that you have. If you want to pull an SQL number, these are the conditions of that SQL number. So we exclude current clients, for instance. So that was kind of it. Message discipline, and like over communicate your strategy. Take the people who are important on the journey with you, and also make sure that what you're delivering, the user interface, actually reflects what you've said you're going to do, and make sure that I guess it all kind of amounts to message discipline. Just make sure that everything you're saying people are seeing.
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting you talk about kind of the leadership side, because on the one hand, it's like you're doing things for people, so you're more of almost like you're kind of like back office response unit in some respects, but then also, and sales leaders probably see themselves as like, the big dogs, but actually what you do does actually determine a lot of their strategy, which is something I hadn't really thought about it, which is why it's so underrated, RevOps.
I think so. I think I like to look at it as an internal product function. So a product function will like talk to customers, do customer interviews, look at data on where revenue is going, and kind of try and tie that back to platform reasons using BI. And a RevOps function is really doing the same thing, except you have the advantage of your customers being your mates, basically. I was going to say mates, like salespeople or like marketing teams. I shouldn't say that, but like
peers.
Peers, yeah, exactly. So yeah, you've got the advantage that you can actually just walk over and talk to them and say like, tell me what you don't like about this, which is nice. Or and yeah, you've got that advantage. I guess the disadvantage is that you don't really have a sense of what is actually shifting the needle. So we could build like a new feature or set a new dashboard and we could see revenue jump up, but it's very difficult to track that back to what you've done.
Okay.
So like, for instance, like let's say we take the dashboard as an example. Let's say we built an excellent pipeline dashboard, which gives people real visibility over like what's due to close next month after, forecast stages, whatever it may be. And suddenly like we hit target the next month. You could say that's because of a like, you know, your pipeline dashboard having an impact, but also it could be just that like the average order value of 2 or 3 clients has gone up massively. So it's very difficult to track back the impact you have, but I still see it as an internal product team, because you don't want to be just the back office team. You want to be like to users, and then leaders of teams are essentially super users, because they're the people who are going to encourage people to use the stuff properly, work out what is best for them, and then take it back to them, and I want to say hope it has an impact on the revenue number. It will have an impact on the revenue number, because you're making things easier for people, but like it's difficult to track your impact, unfortunately.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of kind of measuring the success of the team, you guys don't really have anything in place, or do you have things that you're like sort of working towards when you turn around and go, that was a successful project? Or like, how do you know what you're doing works well, like, apart from just seeing, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think comparing what we did in Q2 and Q3 was a real learning experience. I'm not sure if Lissy mentioned this. So in Q2, we made our objective, make Salesforce a single source of truth. It's so difficult to measure. You could try and measure it by like the amount of times dashboards were run, or you could try and measure it by the number of logins or something stupid. But like you're not going to measure it. What you can do is what we did, is essentially like try and align people around 6 dashboards and really communicate that to the business. The success criteria for me was seeing people using these in meetings. Can't really see them, unfortunately, because I can't just see them in a meeting. And like people using, like Jeremy, our CEO, using it in the revenue, or being able to connect up the sort of metrics we use in our board reporting directly to Salesforce, or whatever it may be. Like that's the kind of degree of success. And we had an objective. Our objective was to make Salesforce the source of truth. Our key result was just to have all of the sort of dashboards that have essentially to have 100% of all sales and marketing reporting done in Salesforce. Probably got 80%, and the effects of that are now seen through the business. I think contrast that to what we did in Q3, where we actually took a different approach and said, our objective is to try and recycle Salesforce data and make it and make sure that we're like constantly feeding back Salesforce data to the sales team. So rather than being like a purely, worker lead, leave it, make sure that we're actually putting in systems and processes in place to like make sure that we're reusing data and not letting sort of not letting sort of like really easy wins and quick money just sit in the CRM because we're really bad at reusing our Salesforce data. And the key result we gave ourselves was that we had to generate a certain amount of pipeline from that. So we said 10% of pipeline for the quarter. We missed that objective. We got about halfway there, but it created like a fair chunk of revenue for the business. So it was like a weird one. But I think what we learned from it really was that goal we'd set ourselves of generating pipeline, which would then essentially turn into money, isn't the right one for a RevOps team, because it really kind of, the best successes we had were with infrastructure, and that was the same in Q2. The pieces of infrastructure that we did put in Q3 will have a long-term impact that we see, because we've gone through the process of building for real users and making sure that we're taking people on the journey with us, communicating why we're doing this and using data to back up our point. But putting revenue operations on a purely like revenue generating sort of task isn't really useful. So yeah, I guess it's important. I think it's important to make sure that you've got an objective. The objective is more important than the kind of like result that you shoot for.
Okay.
My frozen. Oh,
sorry.
No, all good. Yeah. The objective is more important.
Sorry, I've lost you a bit. Oh, there we go.
Back.
We're back.
Yeah. In answer to your question, I think it's just important to make sure that the objective you've got is one that you think is really going to move the needle on the sales team day to day, rather than necessarily pinning it to like a specific what's the word, like a revenue generating number or something.
Yeah, that's interesting. As obviously with working alongside the sales team, they're probably pretty results orientated, so kind of good to know what you're shooting for, I guess. So a more sort of generalized final question, which is a good one to ask, is if you were in a room full of like top RevOps folk who'd like been in it for years, smashing their practices, what would you want to know from them in terms of maybe what you're doing at the moment or personal development or anything like that?
I think a big one is that piece of how to measure success. It's a really big one. It's really difficult to quantify success in a RevOps team, other than anecdotally, people like what we've done.
Yeah.
It's always it's always one of the things I find really rewarding about a RevOps job is that like people appreciate what you do. You've made their lives easier. And then secondly, you've built something. Like I think a good example, we integrated DocuSign and Salesforce, and that like, saved people having to do the same task twice, and people are appreciative for that. But then like that's really good, and you can kind of that you're saving people time, saving people effort, but it's really difficult to tie what you're doing to a number. And really that is kind of what, depending on where RevOps sits within the business, whether it sits under a sales or revenue leader or it sits under an operational leader, it's like if it sits under a revenue leader, like it kind of should, but also
God, there we go. Oh, good.
Yeah, if revenue ops sits under a revenue leader, people will be asking for like your impact on what you're doing, and it's just so difficult to quantify, other than like I've made things quicker.
Yeah, definitely.
Because I think it's right and just that if we have a really good quarter, the sales team should be commended for that. Like if we smash target, that is their work. Like they've done that. Processes that you've put in place really have helped them do that. You'd hope, if you've built them correctly and you've kind of got that sort of anecdotal feedback that like, yeah, this has gone really well. But it is so difficult to quantify. I actually don't think there is a perfect answer to the question. It's kind of like, the whole point is if you're a good ops team, you are successful because your presence isn't felt, if that makes sense. Like if
Yeah.
if everything's working well and there's no bugs and everything is seamless, the ops team is doing a really good job. But that's kind of like negative space. Like if the ops team was fixing loads of things, that would mean like it's going terribly. So it's a difficult one to quantify. But yeah, that's what I'd ask basically.